Welcome back to part two of the France 24 debate. Tonight we're considering the question of Europe's fight against terror in the wake of the attacks on Paris in January and now in Copenhagen. I'm joined here in the studio on tonight's programme by Alexandre DEL VALLE, who's a professor of political science and geopolitics here in Paris. Also by Michael KIRTLEY, who's a producer of the World Memory Film Project. Thank you very much for being with us. And we're joined tonight down the line by Ricardo Baretzky, who's the president of the European Centre for Information Policy and Security, and by Skype from the United States by John BOWEN, who's a professor and author of a number of books on the question of Muslims in Europe and Europe's attitude towards Islam. We've been discussing those attacks in Copenhagen, but also the attacks, the desecration here in France of a Jewish cemetery over the course of the weekend. Once again, Manuel Valls has been speaking to France about the problem.
We must use the full extent of our means to fight against terrorism. We will extend these means for as long as necessary. We must get used to it as much as possible. Get used to this terrorist threat, which mostly comes from international and barbaric organizations, such as the Islamic State organization or Al-Qaeda, but also from radicalized individuals who live on our soil, who are French, and who at any time can turn their weapons against us.
John BOWEN, we've listened there to the French Prime Minister. Of course, France still very much in shock over what happened a month ago, and the message seems to be very clear. Two types of dangers he seemed to outline there: those who've been radicalized from abroad and those who, homegrown here in France, have been inspired by what goes on abroad. But either way, the French had just better get used to the threat.
Is that a question?
What do you make of what he had to say? Is it something France should simply get used to? Is that right?
No, I don't think he's saying this is the status quo for the foreseeable future. He's saying this isn't a one-off event. We can expect more of these. And indeed, as you know very well, there was an expectation all last year that there would be something like what finally happened in January. But this line between people radicalized overseas and people radicalized at home isn't so clear. Of course, the internet cuts across that boundary, and the topics are all blurred. So what we know from some very good reporting in France about individual attempts to radicalize people, recruit them to jihad, many of whom then go to Syria, they go to Iraq, they find out it's not so glorious, it's not just like a video game, they come back and then they're interviewed, is that they're caught up in two kinds of appeals. One is to have a more exciting life, and the other really is the message of come and join your brothers and sisters, because back in France you're not treated well, you're not respected. So there's two parts of the message. It's both come and join us. We can provide you with a group. You do belong to us, and that in France you don't belong. I mentioned the prisons a while ago. That's one of the attractions for people who find themselves in prisons without anyone to protect them, without a group, is to be offered one by somebody who's a radical recruiter. Now, France has long experience with two things. If I can shift the topic just slightly, it has long experience with dealing with terrorism at home. This goes back at least to the 90s, but of course also back to the Algerian War. So there's a relatively long experience with dealing with these problems, and the French judiciary has perfected, maybe not enough, maybe it needs to be ramped up, ways of investigating terrorism on French soil, including monitoring imams, Friday prayer, etc. This has been going on for decades. But France has another tradition which it shouldn't forget. This is a time to sort of step back and say, what is our national community that's going to include Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and people who have no religion whatsoever? And France has a long history of saying, we, the state, have a responsibility to make sure that all of those members of the community are welcome and are free and have the means to practice their religion. So there's a very positive sense of a state engagement, which I think Valls would be well advised to follow with, saying, yes, Jews, Muslims, you're welcome here. And if you have issues regarding your ability to freely practice your religion here, come and talk to us.
I'd like to put both those strands to the other guest. First of all, Alexandre, the restatement of what French values are. That's been very much at the heart of what the French government has been speaking about since the attacks. It's not an empty shell. It's not an absence of values in the face of stronger values. It's something that freedom of speech, tolerance for all religions, secularism of the state, the French believe in strongly and need to be much bolder in speaking about than they have been so far.
Values are a key word, absolutely a key word. And for us, it was horrible, this January attack against Charlie Hebdo, because our system was obliged to accept that it has been defeated, partly defeated, because normally we are the country who is able to integrate anybody, because it's the country of freedom, of international rights, human rights, and normally we can integrate any races, any religion since the encyclopedia and the Enlightenment. It's our national value. And why we cannot integrate some people and why it's less easy than some others. Not because there is something worse in some religions or some ethnies. It's just because we stopped believing in those values. And it's why believes really Mr. Valls, he says that we must rebuild our national integration process that has been weakened, not by the others, but because we did not believe enough in it. If we really want to spread our values, we can do it. But if we want to spread our values, and if we don't want to face enemies that have share the same nationality, the same passport, we must absolutely fight also against those who inside of our nation are spreading hatred ideology. And I can give you an example. Mr. Kardawi, which is one of the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood movement in Europe, he can openly come in France, in England, in all European countries, and he can say that it's legal to kill Jews anywhere. It's legal to go to fight in Iraq and to be a kamikaze. It's even legal to send a son or a daughter to go to make a terrorist attack. How do you want to integrate guys and to explain to them it's not good if you go to ISIS and to join a terrorist group, if they can have as one of the main leader of legal Islam in Europe, someone who believes that it's normal to make jihad against unbelievers.
On that point, Michael, this is one of, and I will then move on with Ricardo to the second part of what was said a moment ago by John about the changes to the law and security that need to be made in the wake of all this. Just on that question, though,
I'm interested to hear what you think. This is one of the big debates that's emerged here in France, is the question of the limits of freedom of speech. So, on one hand, we seem to be drawing limits more clearly, or many people say that we should, about the kind of hate speech that can be tolerated by a tolerant society, even while the question of freedom of speech is at the very heart of what France feels it's defending.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? I think that there's a fallacy. The fallacy is that because people say hateful things, that other people are going to follow them. I think we have to be very careful making that leap. I think that what is often the truth is when this hateful speech comes from some sort of Islamic leader, there's no other positive speech on the other side to also influence. There's no positive society approach to influence. So the hateful speech finds a place to exist. But it's not the hateful speech in itself that creates terrorists. That doesn't make any sense. There's hateful speech all the time in this world. You just look on the internet, not just Muslims, but all kinds of other people. Those don't create terrorists. What creates terrorists, in my opinion, are two things. First of all, feeling that there's a reason to be attracted to this hateful speech. That reason may be because of a sense of not belonging, or because I like as somebody said earlier, the video game aspect of this. There are all kinds of reasons you could be attracted. But I think that the main problem that we're facing is that there's no other message. There's not a positive message. And it's not just coming from France. I mean, that's the problem, is that we can solve that, perhaps that issue in dealing with France. And maybe France could become a model for finding this other way of speaking or other way of communicating.
It certainly seems to have been part of what seems to be a two-pronged attack or response on the part of the French government, Ricardo. The other part are changes to the law, discussions about changes to the law that need to be made in the wake of these attacks, how Europe needs to take on the threat of potential terrorist acts, without going too far in the direction against the very values that Europe stands for, which is not going too far against basic human rights and respect for the privacy of people who live in Europe and their ability to go about their business without being watched by the police all the time. It is a very difficult balance to strike, and one that European leaders are struggling with.
Yeah, I think if I can answer like this, making new laws is not necessarily the solution, right? What we have to understand is we do not want to create a position where the perception in the public is that, well, we live in a policing state. You know, making security doesn't necessarily make people feel safe. So it's a twofold or double sword, you know, with two edges. We have to see the public's view, and public has to feel comfortable that they can trust law enforcement. Now, there's a very thin line between making that happen and bringing in more stronger presence. Now, in another side, a stronger legislation, a stronger presence of police force could make some people feel comfortable and say, well, we live to the European dream of security. You know, but at the same time, the balance is very, very thin. And the lawmakers, a lot of these lawmakers, we find, don't really understand the problems of security and have never had experience on the ground security. Now, you know, and the intelligence forces across Europe will say very confidently that there's a big disconnection between what lawmakers should be doing and what is really happening in the field. And I think this is a very important issue to understand and to address in the future prior to making any laws or making the public more uneasy or uncomfortable of what they're feeling. They should at all times feel safe. And that is the most important part of civil protection. And so far, France has done very good in that. But there's a very thin line in drawing attention to the other side. For example, what's happened in copycats. So we have to understand this, and it's a very complex structure that needs to be defined and understood.
Well, even as we're listening to you, we're watching there the images coming to us from Copenhagen of people who have come out with their candles to mourn those who died in the attacks of Saturday. And to speak out, as they did in Paris in such huge numbers last month, against terrorism. John, one of the things we've been discussing here tonight is, and the same question poses itself in Denmark, since we now know that we're talking about a young Danish man of Palestinian origin, we believe, perhaps disaffected second generation, as the ones who acted here in Paris. One of the questions that poses itself in France is whether the French model, which is one of assimilation as opposed to the multicultural one practiced in Britain, has actually failed young Muslims. Manuel Valls has been touching on it the last few weeks, talking about the apartheid that exists in France. These are things the French have not often talked about, precisely because there is this idea of the Republican value, of the fact that we do not look at questions of ethnicity and origin, because once you are a French citizen, these things are not considered at all. Is that something, do you think, that is proving to have been a mistake, or on the contrary, a strength to which France should cling?
Well, the French political tradition, which values people coming from elsewhere in the world. After all, France is the country of immigration par excellence in Europe, with about a third of French people having at least one grandparent who was born elsewhere. That's a very strong tradition. France should be very proud of its tradition of integration of many different peoples who came with their with their backgrounds, their ethnic backgrounds, with their religions. They were free to practice them, and France did what it could to help them. So that's something to be very proud of. But turning a blind eye to difference is something else, because, of course, this notion that once you're a French citizen, of course, we're talking about people like the Kouachis who were born in France, as was the case with the Danish terrorists. The notion that once you're a citizen, then all difference melts away is foolish, because, of course, racism, anti-Islamic prejudice, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice, these things are rife in France as they are elsewhere in the world. It's not a specifically French problem. So looking these things in the face and saying, look, if you grow up in a certain banlieue, a certain poor outer city, or if you have an Arabic-sounding last name, your CV is likely to get a callback. Well, how do we deal with that? But we have to take whatever means are necessary to do it. And there have been some technical problems about what sort of information can be gathered, et cetera. But France has to say, if we're really going to integrate people, then let's start by making sure that there's equal access to jobs, that there's equal access to good schools. These are the fundamental issues, right? So that's on the issue of apartheid that the Prime Minister has been bringing up. This isn't to say that the people who are recruited to do these terrorist acts do so because they've never been to Paris, they're stuck out in the banlieue. No, these are often people who actually travel around a lot, they know a lot, they're savvy on the internet, but it's not because they're rooted in communities. This is the sort of multiculturalism myth. It's not because they only speak Urdu in Britain or they only speak Moroccan in Paris, something like that. No, it's because they're disaffected. They don't have roots. They feel adrift. The Kouachis, there was a great piece, a long piece in Le Monde on the Kouachis day before yesterday. They really benefited from the French system of looking after people whose parents couldn't take care of them. Again, the France can be proud of that. But once they came of age, they were adrift. There were no jobs, there was no work, so they fell back on bad older habits. So, if France would focus on making everybody feel like they have an equal chance at a job, that the French Republic's promise of equality is really followed through, that's an important step. That isn't to minimize the importance of going against jihad and of having anti-terrorism measures. It's just to say that's one part of a package that needs to be put into place.
That's an interesting point, Alexander, that there is a promise, a Republican promise, that perhaps hasn't been followed through on in France. And it's one of the things that French society needs to ask itself.
I'm not sure, I'm a son of strangers coming from North Africa, Sicilians and Spanish from North Africa. We were as poor as Arabs, Chinese, Vietnamese, and we lived in the same horrible places. Horrible, not for me, but as they say now. We did not feel to be in an apartheid country. We had equal chance. And when I see many people from Vietnamese root, Chinese, Indian, Sikh, we don't feel this exclusions feeling. I think exclusion can come from someone, but it can also come from the own community. And many Islamic leaders have a big responsibility because they spread a kind of persecution, paranoia, ideology. If it happens something to you, it's never your fault. It's always the fault of somebody else. And one of the big ideas in the suburbs in France, many people who don't have job, do you know what they say? Many people in the suburbs with Arab or Muslim roots, they are sure that there is a Jewish plot in order for them to be prevented to have a job, access to job. And it's horrible, but this is a very important idea that many people share. And of course, it doesn't come from France and from our republic, and I think there is no apartheid in France.
But it doesn't just come from the Muslim community either. There are many
It
Christian
comes from leaders who
believe that.
It comes from a so-called anti-racist who spread this victimism ideology, and it's dangerous because when you believe that all what happens to you comes from the others, you are already auto-excluded.
Hitler was the biggest proponent of that kind of. Hitler was the biggest proponent of that idea.
On that question, that perhaps the problem is not so much with France's model as it is with the fact, Michael, that it simply statistically, mathematically has Europe's largest Muslim community and Europe's largest Jewish community. It is natural that it is in France that so many of these tensions
Well, this brings up the thinking that I've had since in listening to our esteemed guest here, and that is that really, even if we implemented all of these different things that we needed to do, it would take a lot of time, to create a society that somehow spoke well to the disaffected Muslim community or the disaffected far-right community, or these different communities that are rising up and creating tension. The real question is, how fast are the terrorist acts going to become routine? That's my question.
And Ricardo, back to you now. It is at European level that these questions need to be sorted out.
Yes, absolutely. If I might say, that we believe that what we are witnessing now is only the beginning and only the birth of many changes possibly to come. There's a lot of concerns about is security forces ready in Europe to deal with this? Are we going to go in a habit of saying, well, it's not our problem, we will let NATO deal with the problem for us? Are we going to increase budgets? And a lot of issues. But I think if I can focus on something specifically, which listening to all our guests pointed out, and this is something rather very important to pay attention to, is that we live in a crisis, and we live in a crisis of identity. Mm-hmm. And the danger what we have is when radicalist and terrorist organizations utilize that platform to further their goals. And they and ineffectively affect the state of affairs surrounding it. So you know, we think that there's a lot of changes necessary, but we have to find the correct solutions. Without the correct solutions, this is going to be a problem and it's going to get much bigger.
We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be hearing from James Creedon now with a look at all that's being said on social media about these issues.
Evening, folks.
How's it going?
Good evening, Lisa.